Hi, this is Chris Heineken bringing you a new installment of our Insight Track interview series. And it's a series in which we invite industry, technology thought leaders to discuss analytics, machine learning, current market trends, and really how companies are evolving to be more data-driven with intelligent systems. And joining me today is Arijit Sengupta, the CEO of Able, and also founder of BeyondCore, which was acquired by Salesforce and now commonly known as Einstein Discovery, as well as I understand recently you are a Harvard Fellow, Arijit, and teaching a course.
So basically, you get to teach a class at Harvard Business School based on the stuff you know.
Outstanding. And that's the subject of it is on AI, right?
It's AI for market-facing functions. So looking at sales, marketing, and customer success, and how you can use AI there.
Perfect. Well, that's a fantastic background. Arijit, you and I have known each other for a few years now. You are definitively a thought leader in the machine learning space. I've learned personally a ton from you over the years, and thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Appreciate it, and I'm glad you didn't bring up my dance background.
Oh, well, we'll have to explore that later. Okay, well, so maybe to get us started off, let's talk a little bit about where you are right now with Able. You've obviously got a very successful track record in the machine learning space. What prompted you to found Able?
Right. So I've been in the AI space for about 20 years now, starting from studying AI at Stanford before it was exciting, right? So I kind of got the last generation of people who had tried and failed with AI, as opposed to the current group who actually haven't met those people. So they don't realize how exciting AI can look in the lab, and then you get it into the wild and it doesn't work that well. Doing the whole BeyondCore thing, the interesting part of it was I got to do about 1,000 AI projects, like I counted at one point. And the main reason I was able to do that was because it was an automated software. Consultants can't do that many projects, but when you're using an automated software, you can. So I had a very interesting perspective on it. But despite having spent 2 decades on it, I found myself encountering a very funny question from certain customers where they would say, Arijit, your AI is never wrong, but it's completely useless. And it took me a while to understand what they meant, because there was actually a grain of truth to what they said. Mm-hmm. Essentially, what they were saying is, look, when your AI tells me a customer will buy, for example, it's never wrong. But it's so obvious. The customers it tells me will buy are so obvious. I would have pursued those customers anyway. And to make my numbers, I got to sell 50 customers this month. If the AI tells me these 10 customers will buy, how do I figure out what's the other 40 I should go after? And it took me a while to understand that what was happening was AI is trained to be accurate. That's just true of all AI in general, right? What does accuracy mean? In a typical sales process, or if you're doing a fraud analysis, for example, the vast majority of people won't buy. So let's say 10% of your prospects buy. That's a good number, right? 10% of your prospects buy. But an AI now says, if I tell you a customer will buy, there are 9 ways of getting it wrong. If I tell you a customer won't buy, there's only 1 way to get it wrong. So if it's trying to be accurate, it tells you not to pursue a customer. It becomes very conservative. So when it tells you a customer will buy, it is right. It demos beautifully. So you do a demo to a senior exec, and the AI does a fantastic job because everything they say the customer will buy, the CEO is like, yes, that guy would have bought. This is great. Then you deploy it, and it just does not create value. In fact, it can destroy value because if it gets too conservative, you stop pursuing customers who would have bought. We had a very interesting customer, Charlie Mero from Mero Sewing Company. He found $3 million of value in a couple of hours of using Able. And the entire reason for it was his AI had gotten so conservative that he was like spending huge amounts of money on marketing, generating leads, and then just not pursuing them. So there was a lot of gold in that leads he already had, and he was just trying to get more and more leads because his AI was telling him not to pursue this stuff. That's why I did it, because you need to go create business impact. It's not about accuracy. It's about creating business impact.
Well, and that kind of gets to the heart of my my next question, which is, it sounds like you founded Able, and really your career work is around how do you get success with AI, right? How do you make impact with it is kind of what I'm gleaning from it. So maybe just to put a finer point on that, if you were educating companies that are trying to figure out, I'm starting my journey and I'm intimidated by this, how should I start and set myself up best for success?
Right. So my life's journey has actually been, how do I empower business users with the power of AI? So
Okay.
Beyond Core was all about how do I use AI to analyze data to figure out what's important in it automatically, right? And by the way, if you look at the whole analytics space now, everybody's trying to do what Beyond Core was doing in 2010, right? In fact, now it became, ISO Discovery just became part of Tableau for that reason. But what I've told people all the time is get started. Find a real project where you're going to get to some quantified ROI. Don't do lab experiments. Don't get scared. Don't try to do the perfect project. Just do something better than what you're doing today. Because you can always make AI better. But when you put into a lot of effort and you get to a perfect model, then something like COVID happens, that model is completely useless. Your goal is, how do I get 10, 20, 30% better than what I'm doing today with the help of AI? Once I've locked that value in, let's iterate, make that AI better. Now get another 20%. And there's a lot of headroom there. You can keep getting value. But if you don't get started and you're waiting for that perfect model, you'll never get to value. And I always start with the revenue projects first, then cost, then risk. And the reason for it is you don't want to do the interesting Twitter analysis project because you're not going to be able to quantify the ROI of it. You have to start with, how can I quantify the ROI? Because the way any new technology gets adopted widely is when there is proof in the organization that the technology has worked. It may work elsewhere, doesn't count as proof. It has to be inside your company. And it has to be a normal business user who got the value. Because if only a PhD data scientist can get value for you, unfortunately, it won't scale.
Right.
AI is like internet. It's like the computer. It is going to be pervasive. So if you need to have a data, like an expert PhD to use it, then you're not going to get value at scale.
That's great takeaway. So get started. Don't assume that you're going to have like a perfect world to get started. It's better to just do better than where you are now and focus on the areas around maybe revenue first. That's kind of an interesting way to think about it. You also hit upon an interesting thing that we observe a lot, which is just the credibility or the believe it factor, the trust factor as it relates to a company. There's a change management component to this too. Any kind of additional thought you have around how you earn trust from those business users that this is better?
So two really important approaches that we incorporated. First, Able does these things called an immediate impact project, where we work with the customer's users and we deliver quantified ROI in 1 month. Just let that sit there for a second. Like, we have gone in and done like $7 million of value in the first month of working with us. Why do we do that? Why do we insist on working with the customer's users? And why do we insist on delivering ROI in 1 month? Notice I'm not saying delivering the biggest possible value. No,
right.
Delivering quantified ROI in 1 month. My customer success team will always say 1 to 2 months, please. I always say 1 month. They usually deliver to 1 month because I say 1 month. But again, that's the time frame where executives can pay attention. They get excited by something new. If you can then prove it within a month, then they're going to act upon it. If it took 2 years to prove it, by that time they've forgotten why they got excited about it in the first place, right? The second part of it is buy-in happens when you take the team and make it part of the process. So Able has this thing called Able for One, which we call it a rapid prototyping tool. So essentially, when you're creating a model with Able, you don't have to then go through a huge exercise to deploy that model and get it in front of the users. You could just create it, press a button, turn on Able for One. A few minutes later, it's in Salesforce, for example, and in Classic or in Lightning. And you're getting predictions inside Salesforce, and you're acting upon it inside Salesforce, and your salespeople are using it. And the salespeople can go in and start giving feedback. They can say, this prediction was great, that prediction was horrible. They can go in and say, hey, this AI is too conservative. This AI is too aggressive. all of that ability for that end user to provide feedback. Now think about who do you need to adopt these technologies? It's actually not the executives. It's the end user who will benefit from it, right? So if you're going to get buy-in from the salesperson, are you going to get buy-in when you tell them, hey, just shut up and do what you're told based on this number that shows up on your screen? Or are you going to get buy-in where we say, hey, you know what? We have this idea. We think it's good. Let me explain what's going on. You have a straight line to the team. You do that thumbs up, thumbs down. You can see that it's getting reflected. You can see what your colleagues are thinking. You can adjust it yourself. Very different level of buy-in when you treat them with respect. It comes from respecting the end user.
It sounds like you just really need to nail the feedback loop, right? So that people feel like they're being heard. One of the things we've observed, I love your commentary on this, is just, a lot of AI models go to die and they never get out of the lab because they never reach the end user. So that kind of final mile feels like a pretty critical final mile. And how do you take that insight and make it actionable? Maybe just talk about that a little bit as a fundamental success factor as well.
So the numbers are horrifying, by the way. Less than 20% of AI models even get deployed.
Right.
So we are putting all this effort to create an AI, and then it just nothing happens. There are a number of people I've met where they've gotten awards from their chairman and from their CEO for the AI model, and you ask them, well, what happened with it? Oh, it never got deployed. Why? Because when I want to take that model and deploy it, it's a very different set of engineering tasks. All the data cleansing I did in some kind of a data lake when I was training the model now needs to get replicated at deployment. And most people don't remember what they did when they cleansed the data. And now I have this interesting model, but how do I keep a whole server running, even though a prediction happens very rarely? There's a lot of DevOps that goes behind this, a lot of engineering that goes behind this. What we did at Able is we said, we are going to encode all of those best practices right in the product. So you create a model in Able, you press a button, that model gets deployed in your AWS account, in your Azure account, in serverless form. All the pipeline gets set up, all of the gateways get set up, the security gets set up, so that within a matter of minutes, you are predicting off that code running. And by the way, all the data cleansing you did, all the data cleansing code got created and deployed at the same time. And then later, if you change your model, if you retrain your model, all of the DevOps is handled for you. So again, what happens is when deploying a model becomes a big lift, people don't want to deploy the model until they get a perfect model, because that's going to be an expensive process. And anything you have pointed at that model, you have to go and then route to a new API. Well, Able sets it up in such a way that if I change out the model, the APIs don't change, the endpoints don't change. The expensive servers are not running. The right function is getting invoked when the prediction is needed. So because all the DevOps have been automated and its iteration is built in, you don't feel like, oh my God, deploying a model is a big thing. Deploying a model and getting to testing with end users is just part of the process.
You hit on a really interesting topic that we also come across, like this notion of you got DevOps and machine learning operations. Like, do you see MLOps as an emerging field? What's your take on that?
MLOps should not be visible to users.
I see.
And look, the problem right now is business users want an iPad that just works. And what people are doing are making things more and more complex. So essentially what they're doing is they're taking the process as it existed before and tooling it up to do it better. The problem was that the process itself was broken. If you think about how a data science model is created, I go in as a business user, I write up a spec, I talk to a data scientist, we don't even speak the same language. The data scientist changed the spec, they go train the model, they come back, try to explain it to me, iterate 15 times over, then they try to see if the model will make money for me. Then they go to IT and deploy it. Then the deployment is not identical. So now let's go back and forth 5 times. Then we get the model deployed, and 3 months later, we find out whether there is any value in that model. That process I just described to you is completely broken. So tooling up a completely broken model doesn't make sense. So like I used to joke, it's like, somebody figured out that a PC assembled for a PC kit is really hard. So instead of coming up with an iPad, they started color coding all the components of the PC kit and making up pretty assembly instructions. That's not the solution. The solution is the iPad. With Able, we have automated MLOps. MLOps is not something that smacks you in the face. In fact, most of our users don't even realize that they have deployed a model.
I love that point of view. That's great. How about you? You've mentioned a couple things around, resiliency iteration. Obviously, with COVID, I think when you and I were talking back when it first hit, you were saying pretty much, hey, every single model on the planet just is now obsolete. How do you think through and coach your customers and prospects on thinking through how AI can bring adaptability and resiliency in these times?
Right. So the fundamental flaw in AI is that every product in the market other than Able focuses on creating a perfect model. Think about what that means. It means you're putting in all this effort to create a perfect model, which reflects the data that it was trained on. So the moment the world changes, that AI is out of date. What Able does is it says, look, the world is going to change. And depending on my circumstances, there'll be a different optimal model. So we deploy something called an efficient frontier of models, which could be 40, 50, 60 models. One model is optimal if your average deal size goes up 30%. One model is optimal if your conversion rate goes down 20%. Then when the reality reveals itself, you figure out what the world is like. The system tells you, hey, looking at your current conversion rates and current average deal size, you should probably be in a different setting on the frontier. Or your end users can go in and say, hey, looking at where I am, I want to go more aggressive or more conservative. What you're doing is you're switching from one model to a different model. And by the way, this is how the world has always worked. If you think about how factories work, how manufacturing work, we don't have one setting. We actually set up a portfolio of settings and say, given circumstances, I'm going to switch from one to the other. Then why the heck are we creating one perfect model? Think of it this way. In model training, we don't even ask you, what does the population you're going to predict look like? If I give you 10 years of training data, well, the next 6 months of predictions won't look like your 10 years of training data. Then how are we training a model without even asking you how you expect to use that model? In Able, we literally ask you that. It's like, what do you expect the future to look like? How many transactions do you think? What do you think your expected conversion rate will be? You won't know for perfect, but we can dial in the AI to do well in the way you'll use the AI, as opposed to building a perfect AI that does beautifully if your prediction data looks just like your training data, which it never does. So the whole world of AI is fundamentally broken right now. By the way, when I have this conversation with data scientists, I wrote a book called AI is a Waste of Money. And as you can imagine, the conversation always starts with people saying, you're crazy, you're just sensationalist. And I take them through these about 15 minutes of conversation where at the end of them, they admit that AI is fundamentally broken. We're doing some very stupid things. It's just that nobody wants to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes because the industry makes money from hyping up AI.
Well, that's a very well-informed. I love the point of view again, Arijit. Two more questions for you here, just to think about. You hit a little bit on use cases, go to revenue first. I'd love to drill in on that a little bit more, because that's one of the questions we field a ton around, which is like, where do I start? Any other kind of rules of the road that you would say on, or maybe use cases that you're just in love with that you've come across over the last few months that are great themes for you?
Right. So we actually did a lot of analysis in the post-COVID time, because for a period of time, we were actually providing our technology for free to companies, helping them turn around. And the top use cases turned out to be sales optimization, because right now they really need to figure out how to make more money and often do more with less, right?
Yep.
Second is marketing optimization. Third, actually, depending on the company, it's either collections effectiveness. We have found companies that have been fundamentally rethinking their collection strategy in the COVID world, or customer retention.
Yep.
Then the fifth, for a long way after that, is operations effectiveness. Unfortunately, most of the time customers come in and want to talk about operations effectiveness because they think that's a good place to cut costs. You don't want to focus on just cutting costs. You want to focus on how can you make more money and make your company successful at this moment. And as COVID, over the next 6 months, we're going to transition back out of the COVID world. You want to set yourself up for success now. Because when things change rapidly is exactly where you want to use the kind of techniques I've been talking about, where AI helps you understand shifts and react to shifts far faster than you could otherwise. You don't want to be on the other side of that shift and say, oh, I never took the chance to turn it into a competitive advantage.
So it sounds like the big theme is really productivity plays, productivity around sales, marketing, collections. Is that
ROI play? I actually deliberately don't say productivity because productivity again implies to people, how do I do, they get obsessed with, can I reduce my sales team size? And what we keep telling them is, well, why don't I show you how you're going to make the most money? And then see whether that means you should reduce your sales team or increase your sales team or reallocate your sales team from one function to the other. Don't start from a mindset of, I got to cut costs. Because if you think the world is full of nails, you'll start out with a hammer and then everything will become a nail.
right?
In our case, we said, why don't we agree what your goal is? If it's ROI, AI will help you figure out where the optimal strategy is a resource reduction or actually a growth strategy.
And then kind of last question for you, Arijit. How does this, you've hit upon a lot of kind of the underpinnings of Able and the technology platform itself, but kind of zooming out, just curious your take on technology platforms and the convergence of AI. So thousands of AI companies, some are platforms, some are purpose built, a lot of M&A. Kind of how do you see the whole landscape playing out over the next few years?
So the first problem is most companies actually are not AI companies. Most companies in the space, even today, are consulting companies that act like they're software companies. I used to have this challenge with people. I was like, look, though we say it'll take a month to get to ROI, we'll happily take a challenge with the customer where in 1 hour, we'll get a model up and running and deployed. And the reason we do that is to show the fact that there's no consulting there. Because even with the best consultant, you can't go from a raw data to a model deployed, integrated with Salesforce in 1 hour. It's a magic trick. But it's a magic trick to make a point, which is there is no, this is a software solution you're seeing. Most so-called AI companies, when you scratch the surface, you're not going to see that.
Right.
Major companies that essentially insist on 1 year of consulting support to be included in the deal. All they're doing is selling services, and you're never going to be able to scale. Like, remember, this is as simple as the internet or a keyboard. Imagine if you had to go to somebody to help you use the browser every day. Would the internet have had any impact? Everybody in your company has to be able to do it. So it's just a fundamental rethink. So most of the AI companies are going to die out. VCs are investing like crazy because it is the next big hype. By the way, expert systems were hyped like this a few decades back. These things happen. AI winters happen precisely because people oversell their stuff. But as long as you work with companies that are obsessively focused with delivering ROI, not shiny objects, but ROI in a short period of time, quantified ROI in a short period of time. Do you care whether they're doing it based on AI or a magic 8-ball? Who cares? As long as they can predictably and repeatably deliver quantified ROI very quickly, what do you call the technology doesn't matter.
That is great advice and a great closure point to this. Arijit, thank you so much for joining today. Maybe if we do a second part of this, you can give us your dancing tips. You started off with.
No, I was a dance minor. I think you forgot. So I always get made fun of because my degrees were computer science, economics, dance, and then MBA. So people always make fun of the dance part in the middle. So.
Well, you're always fun to have on and to learn from, and I really appreciate your time today, Arijit. So thank you for joining us.
Good to see you guys. Thank you so much.